So I just recorded half of this chapter and then realized I wasn't recording it. So I was just talking to myself and not even recording it. We're going to try this again. So we're going to be talking about sampling in this chapter. And we're mostly going to be looking at biases that come into play in different types of samplings. So if you want to know, like, how many people are voting a specific way in a type of, or in an election, you're going to sample a population and ask them who they're voting for. Don't worry about this slide. Okay, we're going to talk about 4 words here. Population. So a population is everybody you care about. So let's go back to the election thing. So if I want to know in the US how many people are planning to vote for somebody, I'm going to care about the whole entire US. So it's the entire group of people that we're interested in. Versus a sample, you can't ask every single person in the US who they're voting for. So we take a sample population of that to represent the whole population. So the sample is a portion or subset of the population. So it's just the group of people you survey or sample. Can't use the word sample because it already has sample. Versus population is everyone. Okay, parameter and statistic. Parameter goes with population. So let's say in the US, actually, let me look this up. I wonder how many people are Republicans. Percent of Republicans in the US. So 30% of Americans identify as Republican in the US. So our population is all Americans. The parameter is the 30% of them that identify as Republicans. I can then sample maybe 200 of the people in the US. That would be the sample, is 200 people. And the statistic would be the number of people from that sample who identify as Republican. So the statistic is the number from the sample. So let me do another example here. Let's say we have of college graduates with bachelor's degrees. 63% with bachelor's completed in 4 years. So completed their bachelor's degree in 4 years. I sample 100 student athletes who have graduated, so they were student athletes, and I found that 47 of them completed their bachelor's degree in 4 years. So let's identify these things. We've got the population, the parameter, the sample, and the statistic. Okay, the population is everybody we're talking about. So right now, the population is the college graduates. And specifically, college graduates with bachelor's, if you want to get that specific. Sorry, this is getting squeezed in. Okay, parameter is the number that describes a population characteristic. So if we look, the next thing here says 63% of college graduates complete in 4 years. So that parameter is 63%. Then it goes on to describe the sample. So I said 100 student athletes. So there's my sample, 100 student athletes who have graduated with their bachelor's. And I found 47 of the 100, or 47% of them, had finished with their bachelor's degree in 4 years. Okay, next thing we need to talk about is sampling. So with sampling, it's really easy to make very big mistakes. So we're just going to look at a couple big mistakes that have happened over the years, and then discuss some biases that can cause problems as you're taking samples. So way back in 1936, the Literary Digest put out a survey asking people who they plan to vote for, Roosevelt or Landon. And their results, they sent out the survey to 10 million people. When they returned the surveys, the results were Landon was going to win 57% to 43%. But what actually happened was Roosevelt won 62% to 38%. And that is a huge difference. And so Literary Digest actually went bankrupt because of this mistake. People came back and said, you made a serious mistake here. We don't trust you anymore. We're not going to buy your magazine anymore. And they came out with a bunch of different quotes like, well, we didn't ever say we were completely infallible. We've been doing this way forever. We don't know what went wrong. So let's look at what went wrong here. To make the survey or to make the sample, they just sent out surveys to people who were on their subscription list for the Literary Digest magazine, were country club members, or had a vehicle registered. Okay, remember back in 1936, if you had a vehicle, it meant you were rich. Same thing with subscribing to a magazine, or you had a country club membership. So what that means is they only send it out to the rich people. They didn't send it out to the middle class or the low class people, poverty. Yeah, I don't remember what that bottom class is called. That's okay. And they said, well, yeah, but we sent it out to, 10 million people, 100 million people? 10 million people. So that should have made up for the fact that we didn't sample everybody. But what happened was they sampled so many people that their results were biased. And then because they sampled 10 million people, their results were biased times 10 million. I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously. And only this many returned the survey. But the results were biased and compounded on a much larger scale because they sampled such a large amount of people. So their procedure was biased, and because they repeated the basic mistake on a larger scale, it was extremely biased. They also had a non-response bias where people who don't care so much about the election or who don't have strong opinions one way or the other, they're not going to respond to the survey. They're not going to take the time to fill it out and mail it back in. It's only the people who have strong opinions that will take the time to fill it back out and send it in. We can see another example from another election, Truman versus Dewey, where we have 3 different surveys, Crossley, Gallup, and Roper. All 3 of them were people who had been sending out surveys, or companies who had been sending out surveys for years, and all 3 of them said Dewey was sure to win the election when actually it was Truman. So Roper and the other 2 said, well, we were gone. We're going to have to figure out we were wrong. We're going to have to figure out why we were wrong. And so they dove into it to see their mistake. And what they discovered is they had been quota sampling for years. And what that means is they tried to match the characteristics of the population. So take St. Louis, for example. In St. Louis, they decided to survey 17 subjects or people. And when they did this, they tried to match the characteristics of the population as closely as possible. So they did about half suburbs, half city, which in St. Louis, that's about the population. Half the people live in the suburbs, half live in city. About half men, half women. Again, following that, about half under 40, half over 40. The population of white to black at that time was 6-1, so they tried to match that. And then same with monthly rent to get different levels of income surveyed there. But what happened when they did this was they had some biases in that people were literally knocking door to door. And so if I'm out knocking door to door and I see a sketchy area where I feel like I might get mugged, I'm going to skip that area. Or if I see a yard with a couple big scary dogs, I'm not going to go knock on that door. So we have this selection bias from humans that causes these errors. And they actually consistently chose too many Republicans for whatever reason as they did that. This didn't make a problem until the 1948 election, but just as the country continued developing, as more people started voting, we saw more problems with it. And so quota sampling just doesn't guarantee that the sample will actually resemble the country because there's too much too much room for that human error. So quota sampling, not so great. It sounds really great. It sounds like a good idea, trying to match the sample to the population characteristics, but it just doesn't work. So instead what we do is called a simple random sample, where if you sample enough people, according to the law of averages, your results should follow what the actual population is. And one way to do that is to take, let's say we're sampling all seniors in at Green Canyon High. We can take every single one of the seniors, put a name on a ticket, and then randomly draw out 100 of the seniors to sample. That sample of 100 seniors should follow the approximate character distribution of all seniors at Green Canyon High School. But we can have problems with that sometimes, where sometimes it's not always possible. If I'm sampling the whole U.S., I can't take every single name, put it in a box, and draw out 100 people from that box. And it can also be very expensive to hire the manpower to be able to do something like that. So if it's possible to do a simple random sample, that's what you want to do. Random is always best, but sometimes it's not possible to do it. So another sampling method you can do is called cluster sampling, where so here's the U.S. You take the different regions of the U.S. And so we have West, Midwest, Northeast, and South. Let's take the Northeast and split the Northeast into different towns. So they're going to choose randomly several towns from the Northeast. And then from each of those towns in the Northeast, they're going to choose wards or different sections of that town, and then subsections, several subsections of each of these, and then choose several households from each of these subsections to get that clustering sample where they are randomly selecting subgroups to represent the general population. There's also samples of convenience. Those aren't super great. That's like where if you stand in front of the store and sample everybody as they come in, that's a sample of convenience. So let's talk about response bias here. I kind of ranted about this at the beginning of the trimester, I think with 5th hour. There was a news article that said something like 20% of millennials don't know about the Holocaust. And so I delve into the data on this more. And what really happened was the question was just worded really dumb to cause some issues. And then they were taking the data and warping it as well. And so this next slide, it's not talking about that survey specifically, but this is another example of something similar that happened. So here's a question. Does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Okay, that question is super confusing just in the way it's worded. And so 22% of people responded it seemed possible. So let's go back and read what are they even saying seemed possible. It seemed possible that the Nazi extermination never happened. Okay, but in order to understand what they were saying, I had to read that again. And so this wording on this question is very confusing, and it can lead to people responding something they don't actually mean. And then people say, oh, look, everybody's dumb. Schools are not teaching about the Holocaust. We've got some problems going on. When really it's just the statistics have been warped and they're lying with this data that's not accurate. So another way they could phrase that question is to explain what it is they're talking about. The term Holocaust usually refers to the killing of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps during World War II. In your opinion, did the Holocaust definitely happen, probably not happen, or definitely did not happen? We've got 4% of these conspiracy theorist people out there saying it probably did not or did not happen. And then everybody else says, yeah, it happened. We've learned about it. We've seen evidence of it. We know that it happened. And that shows an example of response bias where the questions are phrased in a leading or confusing way. Another example, if I were to ask all teenagers if they'd smoked or not, some are going to be truthful, some are going to lie about it. And talk is cheap. People talk a good game, but they don't always live up to it. Volunteer response bias, if you're asking people to call in and tell you their opinion, you're only going to get a small population and a very opinionated population if you do something like that. Okay, we've talked about biases like that before. Don't care about that slide. Don't care about that slide. Oh, look, we're done. Okay, this is your homework. I think from this we just crossed off number 12. This is due Friday, April